Hi, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt. I'm pleased to invite you to our call today with David Makovsky. It's the fifth in our series of calls. Other interviews, by the way, are available on our website, www.zionisrabbis.org, including the calls and conversations we had with Dory Gold, with Bougie Herzog. I especially want to call your attention to the one with Einat Wilf. We had a call with Ambassador Ron Dermer, but that one was off the record and therefore wasn't recorded. Our next call will be with Danny Dayan, and that'll be on Tuesday, July 21st at 1:30. Danny Dayan is known as the Israel's Consul General, which is often referred to as Israel's ambassador to the American Jewish community. So it's a very important call for rabbis to participate in. And then after the call with Danny Dayan, which will be our sixth call, we're going to schedule an interactive Zoom call for rabbis to discuss and to process these important conversations. That'll be open only to those who have actually joined the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition. So if you haven't yet joined, I urge you to please go to our website to do so. We currently have over 75 rabbis who have signed on, who have endorsed our mission statement. We welcome you to read it and to join us and to become a part of the organization, which is devoted to promoting Jewish unity, understanding, and cooperation among the Jewish communities of Israel and of the diaspora. So it's my pleasure now to introduce David Makovsky. David is absolutely, to sum up his resume in a word, is brilliant. But that doesn't quite do full justice. He is the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute and Director of the Project on Arab-Israel Relations. A profound thinker, he's an adjunct professor in Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. From 2013 to 2014, he served as senior advisor to the special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in the State Department. He has written numerous monographs and essays on issues related to the Middle East peace process, the Arab-Israeli conflict. One of the fortunate things for you, David, is that it's a full-time job, I take it. And with Dennis Ross, he recently wrote this wonderful book called Be Strong and of Good Courage, how Israel's most important leaders shaped its destiny. He's written so many different kinds of monographs, articles, books, including an interactive map, which is those of us who have attended APAC conferences have had a chance to see. I just want to mention that he's very prolific, and you can find his writings on his website, davidmakovsky.com. Before joining the Washington Institute, he was an award-winning journalist who covered the peace process from 1989 to 2000, when he also had served as executive editor of the Jerusalem Post, diplomatic correspondent for Haaretz, and other important organizations as well. David is originally from St. Louis, Missouri, and got his bachelor's degree from Columbia University, a master's degree in Middle East Studies from Harvard University. And so it's now my pleasure to invite David Makovsky to join us, the rabbis and guests who are with us today on this call sponsored by the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition.
Thank you,
David?
Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi. And I can't say no to Rabbi Weinblatt. I really see you. I don't mean to embarrass you, as a really embodiment of someone who has a real sense of Ahavat Yisrael, a sense of Klal Yisrael. And so when you asked me to help, I couldn't refuse. I just salute you for your love of the Jewish people. So look, so I will talk a little bit. I'll try not to talk too long so we can have a discussion moderated by Rabbi Weinblatt. I'll try to give a sense of where I think the state of play is now on this issue between the U.S. and Israel on the annexation issue, and where could it go? So look, I think the big picture, of course, is like everywhere else in the world. It's Corona, COVID, COVID, COVID. That is where Israel's focus is. If you watch the newscasts in Israel, and I watch them in Hebrew twice a day on the different network channels at the prime time, it's clear that's the only issue. They asked people, what is your number one priority? 69% said, even before the spike up, either 69% said economic implications of COVID, another 15% said COVID, 4% said annexation. So it's an issue that's probably gotten more attention outside of Israel than inside of Israel, and certainly the rise in COVID has only accelerated that. But I've learned something from my old days as a journalist. Sometimes The news isn't what happens, it's what doesn't happen. And just because something is out of sight, it doesn't make it out of mind. I think the prime minister is determined on this. I think he's working very feverishly behind the scenes with the Trump White House. I think he's very concerned about, the sense of a presidential timetable, that if he doesn't do it soon and if Biden is still ahead, this won't happen. So I think, the real story is American presidential politics is kind of what's driving this. And I think it's somewhat, the prime minister believes that timetable means you have to push sooner, because if Trump is down 15 points in October, that's not the right time for this. So I just think out of sight does not mean out of mind. And I tend to think that, that this issue is alive. What's the differences between the White House and the president, and the prime minister, you might ask? From my understanding, talking to different sides here, I think that Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, very much says, hey, this is a peace plan. It's not an annexation plan. You have to commit to the whole plan. In order, we heard the phrase that they say, in order to get, you got to give. So if you want, to annex some of the 29% of the West Bank, you have to show that you're committed to giving the other a part. And we don't want this to look unilateral. We want there to be a package deal for the Palestinians as well. And we want no building in the areas that would be designated as a future Palestinian state. I think in January, the prime minister had no problem with any of this. But what's happened is that the settlers are not a monolith, even though they're depicted as a monolith in the media. But the block settlers, as we'll talk about when I show you the maps, they're the ones inside the fence, inside the security barrier. They basically want to be annexed to end the limbo status. But the more ideological settlers outside the barrier feel that there's been no conditioning of the societal landscape to make them believe that in order to get, they have to give. And they'll say, look, you're going to be inside the barrier. We're outside the barrier, and we're going to have this entity potentially on our doorstep, and we don't like it. And so we say, take the 30% and don't give. And that is, the prime minister has been loath to alienate his base. I think he's more indebted to his base the more he faces his own legal challenges. So anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. People will ask me, well, where does this whole annexation come from? Did it start with the Trump plan? And we're going to show you a map of the plan. But before we get into the maps, I just thought it would be just useful to zoom out. Sorry to use the metaphor for a second. And that is, where did this idea, what's the road here? Where did it all come from? I think there were a few factors that impacted this road. I want to show both sides of the debate, where it came from and where the opposition to it is. Where it came from is, I think you have to go back to the Second Intifada, 2000 to 2004, where the peace camp in Israel is decimated. 1,000 Israelis are killed. 3,000 Palestinians, I should say, are killed too. Israel will say no equivalence. The Israelis are killed in bus bombings, pizza bombings, movie disco bombings. The others are collateral damage. But the fact that there was all this violence really decimated the peace camp, and Israel started moving to the right. Then you had the Hamas takeover of Gaza in 2007, and that accelerated that trend. I think the fact that the U.S. tried on 3 occasions, one at Camp David, 2007-8 Condi Rice, and Olmert and Abbas. The third effort I was a part of, 2013-14 with Kerry. They were efforts to end this conflict, to deal with the 5 core issues. What are going to be the borders, the security arrangements, the refugees, Jerusalem, mutual recognition? Do you accept the character of the other side state? But, you tried to hit the home run ball 3 times, that Clinton time in 2000, the Condi Rice time, the Kerry time. And when you said, okay, the Venn diagram doesn't overlap between Bibi and Abbas, one side's minimum is not the other side's maximum. And then you add to that, I think, Netanyahu drawing closer to the right. He used to talk in the Knesset about blocks, saying that was where he was focused on. and in peace negotiations, but now he does not use the word blocks, so he doesn't want to alienate the other parts of the right that don't live in settlement blocks, but live outside the barrier. And you add all this together, and then I think you see the road to annexation. Well, we've been in limbo long enough. There is no deal. You try to hit the home run ball, but when you hit the home run ball, you can strike out. And then add on top of that, what I just mentioned now, which is the presidential calendar, feeling that Trump is not doing well in the polls. If he was doing well in the polls, this would not be an issue now. It could be talked about in 2021. But if you add all this together, this is kind of the road to annexation, and the timing relates to the presidential politics. Now let's go to the maps, and just to give you a sense of what the Trump peace plan is. And we'll do that. Let's do, okay, well, first we could start here about where do people live? Where do the settlers live? So you see that they mostly live in these, what we call blocks or settlement clusters inside the security barrier. There's like a majority of the settlers live in a minority of the settlement. So 358,000 live inside the barrier. And I'm sorry, these maps don't look elegant. The truth is there's a lot of aerial imagery in each one of these things, which we could get into if we have time, but most of the settlers live there. And now the non-block settlers live outside. They're scattered around the West Bank, and that's another 107,800 people in another 78 settlements. And so basically what you find is that most of the peace plans were based on the idea, even though they were not maps at every point. I can tell you in our period, the prime minister was very afraid of maps. He thought it was political dynamite. He wanted to wait on maps. But most of the peace plan, you could say, look, it would have been, the block settlers might have gotten annexed, but not the non-block. What the Trump plan tries to do is to say, I want to annex everyone. That's kind of the animating principle, is that instead of 52, there'll be now 130 settlements, and the map will look like this. Again, I want you to know that these numbers that I get are Israeli governmental numbers. The mapping agency I deal with is a very blue chip American company. I have Israeli aerial imagery for every single settlement. So basically, when people say, well, what is this Trump plan? It looks like this: 130 settlements, 466,000. Now, to be technically very precise, 15 of the 130 are not fully annexed. They are called enclaves in a Palestinian entity. So whatever's going to be in purple is Israel. All the way down the right side, that's the Jordan Valley, and all the way on the left side, that's where the blocks, and that's where most of the settlers are. The blue are the settlements themselves. The yellow are Palestinian villages and towns. And basically, the idea of the Trump plan is that Israel is basically encircles this Palestinian state. It's to their east and to their west. Of course, to the north is the Galil, Israel. To the south is the Negev, Israel. Israel will decide who goes in and out of this thing, and Israel will have overriding security. Palestinians say, okay, that's not a state. That's an encircled entity that Israel goes in and out of like it does today. So they reject it. So what happened was that Netanyahu came right back to the Trump administration and said, look, they said no. So let me front load, and my part, we'll keep the 70%, maybe they'll reconsider, but at least let me take the 29%. And by the way, the Trump plan does add certain land swaps. So it's, instead of 70-30, you could say it's 80-30 in a certain way. Land inside of Israel, pre-67 Israel. But the question is this workable? And basically Dennis Ross and I wrote our book. It just came out in Hebrew last week, Yediot Achronot. We're concerned this will accelerate a one-state situation. The Palestinians will say, you know what, we don't consider this a state. If this is the only basis, forget it. We give up and we want to vote in Israeli elections. Now that might sound fanciful to people, to rabbis across the country. What do you mean they'll vote in Israeli elections? Israel's not going to allow them to vote in Israeli elections. That's 2.8 million Palestinians in the West Bank, doesn't include 2 million in Gaza, another 300,000 plus in Jerusalem. You know, there's no way Israel can allow that, and Israel would never allow it. But it will create pressures here along the lines we saw with Peter Beinart's article yesterday. I wrote a piece, he wrote it last week. Dennis Ross and I responded in the American Interest, why we think Peter is completely wrong and his ideas are unworkable besides being wrong. But the point is that we're worried about a scenario that the Palestinians say, forget it, we want the vote, and the American DNA is one person, one vote. So we think that Israel has a stake, if it cares about bipartisanship in the US, to avert this situation that they give up, and they press for voting rights in Israel, and the paradigm shifts. So where the Trump administration is at is to say, okay, look, we don't know if it's a good idea to take 29%. Now, it might not be a good idea, but if you want some, you gotta, like I said before, you gotta give, not just take. And here Netanyahu was backtracking a bit from where I think he was in January. Now, where does the arguments against annexation? The arguments, therefore, I said the road to annexation, why Israelis felt impatient, they felt the peace process was not yielding results. But at the same time, the real sense here of the opposition is coming from really elements in the security establishment, which I take very seriously. And that approach is to say, look, we don't know if there's going to be violence. I mean, people predicted maybe there'd be violence after the embassy would move, and it didn't happen in big measure. The bigger issue is not violence, but will this be the beginning of the end of the Palestinian Authority? Will it collapse? And if it collapses, is this good for Israel? You have people like Amos Gilad and Gadi Eisenkot and others who say, you don't want this thing to collapse. Then for sure you're going to have a one-state situation. Plus Israel's going to have to pay billions of shekels to actually directly, control, provide services to Palestinian lives. So that's been one piece of opposition. Another piece of opposition comes from the state of Jordan. And that has said, listen, maybe you guys, you got a good thing going. You control the area without having to annex it. Your longest border, Israel, is with us. And we're working together, patrolling the Jordan Valley to make sure that radicals and material don't get in. In the old days, before the Jordan Valley, the peace treaty, before the Treaty of 94, you could say Israel's worried about an attack from the east, but that hasn't happened since 1967. So, people say, look, you've got the best of both worlds. You have the arrangements and you don't have the responsibility of annexation in people's mind. Jordan has said this will be a massive collision, as the king's word. As prime minister went on CNN, said there'll be a freeze of the treaty. We don't know yet. The Arab states, though, are the ones that I'm probably most concerned about, because Israel's got an amazing under-the-table relationship going with the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf. And I was in Bahrain in June, and I was in Abu Dhabi in March, and they all said the same to me. David, look, we don't know what Trump is going to do. If he leaves the Middle East, if he, doesn't leave the Middle East. But we know one thing, Israel is there to stay. And we want to work with Israel to keep Iran out, to help thwart Iran's regional ambitions, and let alone the nuclear program. So I think that's strategically so important for Israel to have these new sets of relationships. And if I would talk about this 5 years ago, you'd say, David, you're on drugs. Impossible. So, that's a consideration. And this is where it's the irony in Jewish life today, that I'm sure if you said at your synagogues, where are Israel's best relationships? In the Middle East, they're with Arab militaries. I don't think anyone would have predicted that. And that's what's beautiful. This isn't your grandfather or grandmother's Middle East anymore. It's a new Middle East where there's opportunities and not just problems. And I think that that should be the priority. Then, the other opposition comes from Europe, which is Israel's largest trading partner, not the US, Europe is. And Israel gets a lot of benefit from European projects that you need a consensus. You need all 28 countries to agree. They have high-tech programs that links the Israeli scientific community into Europe, and you don't want to put that at risk. Then there's the US, and others have talked about it, so I don't really want to get into it, about the bipartisanship, kind of the moment we're in. Maybe we'll discuss it with Rabbi Weinblatt. What does this mean for young, progressive American Jews? So all I'm saying is that these are issues that you need to take seriously. Now, what the administration is trying to do is to square a circle. They have wanted close ties with the Gulf leaders. And the way they've tried to square it goes like this. You know, Israel, we've thought about it, and we think this should be a consensus with you, Bibi, and blue and white. And they're basically trying to put the onus on Gantz and Ashkenazi, the leaders, two former chiefs of staff, the defense minister and the foreign minister, figuring for their own purposes, they will go for either a low-end annexation or no annexation. And Gantz, with the spike of Corona, has said, let's defer this whole issue until after Corona. People don't have jobs. So we'll see where that ends up. So just to summarize, I don't want to talk too long here, and I want to keep to, you know, on the button 20 minutes, is that it's still in play. It's just out of the public mindset for the last 2 weeks because of the overwhelming, crushing importance of Corona. I don't think this prime minister has given up. I think he's working quietly behind the scenes. He's just not talking about it publicly because the public is just not in that kind of mood at this time. So we'll need to see how it sorts itself out, you know, stay tuned, and we'll see how it unfolds. So Rabbi, thank you for your hospitality for this Zoom, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you. Unbelievable. You know, as always, David, you just have in such a concise way, a way of summarizing very complex issues. There are times I've heard you speak and I've thought, gee, you know, it looks so easy. And then other times, and yet it's so complicated. So I want to come to that. And people who do have questions, please feel free to send them and I'll be asking them. I've heard you speak a number of times about some of the conversations you've had with Arab leaders, especially with Palestinian leaders, and the hopeful, positive things they've said. But then they'll go and we don't hear those things in public. We don't hear them certainly in Arabic. And I know you've said you try and tell them that, but until that happens, David, what hope is there? And based on that, I want to ask you this. You've referred to the Clinton talks. You referred to the talks with Secretary of State Rice as well as with Kerry. And by the way, in your book, I read about that we really should be including the fact that Ariel Sharon sent his son to meet with Arafat. I hadn't realized that.
Yeah.
So really, it's not just three times they've said no, it's really 4 or 5 times. Did it ever occur to you, maybe they really don't want a state?
Yeah.
That maybe
I've thought about it. Look, I agree. Look, here's the thing, and this is where it kind of separates me from like people on the left end zone of this debate. If I'm not on the right end zone, I like to, maybe everyone likes to see themselves in the 50-yard line of this issue. Look, I take Israeli security considerations extremely seriously. We at the Washington Institute, like I said, we just had the chief of staff, Gadi Eisenkot, the last one. I had like a daily chavruta, a daily study session with him for 6 months every day. And I talked to him, and I talked to all the other generals that come through the Washington Institute, and we go there, and just like I go to Ramallah too. But we take security really seriously. It's not a footnote. If the lion lies down with the lamb in the Middle East, Israel has to be the lion. It's just the way it is, given the nature of the Middle East being a rough part of the world. So I want to start with that. I never excuse away, I don't know, if someone said, well, they named a summer camp after so-and-so, and of course that's disgusting. And, my point about gradualism, which is not sexy with the left end zone of this debate, is to say, well, you know what, you swing to try to hit the home run, and when you try to hit a home run, you could strike out. And my view is, let's go for the solid singles that get to the kishkas of both sides. I mean, what does it really come down to, I think, is that for the Israelis, they want to know they are accepted in this region, that it's not just because they're the military stronger force, but that they are recognized as a legitimate entity. And I personally think that means you don't pay money to relatives of perpetrators of violence. It sends a signal, that you want to incentivize violence. Now they'll say, no, that's a pre-Oslo thing, but okay, but cancel it. Symbolism is important, and you have to deal with that. And a solid single that affects the Kishkas for the Palestinians is, David, you say we're not ready for the grand deal, but how do I know that by deferring an issue, I'm not conceding an issue? What guarantee is there for me that you're leaving the door open? Okay, you say it's too complicated, that the Venn diagram doesn't overlap. So how do I know that by shutting the door, you're precluding 20 years from now this issue being resolved? And that's the solid single that I see, sorry for all the baseball metaphors, is basically the solid single that's hard for Israel to say, okay, don't build over the fence. You know, we build in the blocks. We don't go beyond the blocks. If you build in the blocks with these land exchanges, it's consistent with two states. But if you build everywhere, I don't think, I do think the Palestinians are going to give up, and they're going to just say, we want to vote in Israeli elections, which is something Israel can't accept. By definition, it won't be a Zionist country. So I think we go, don't overreach, right? You're the rabbi, not me. The Talmud, right, doesn't say tafasta maruba lo tafasta. If you overreach, you haven't achieved. So I'm for a more gradualist school that doesn't excite people in the left end zone, I would say. But I feel that's the only way. And look, to me, Rabbi, I'll just say, because this is really important to me, your question is I think it's a matter of personal integrity for me. I don't just listen to what they whisper to me. I never believe in that. I mean, I think it's interesting and it's important. It always counts to me what people do, not just what people say. And that to me is the rubber meeting the road. So I never want to ever be seduced or something by what someone says to me over a glass of arak or, or whatever it is. I don't drink arak, just for the record. But to me, what counts is security, daily, day in, day out, securely cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian Authority to keep Hamas out of the West Bank. That's what I care the most about, because to me, that's the rubber hitting the road. I want to know, and not just what they whisper to some guy who flies in from Washington, D.C., but are they working together, as they say in Hebrew, before, actively, to thwart attacks? And the answer is yes. And that's why people always say to me, I'm always amazed, you and Dennis, you keep at this. How is it, where do you get the strength to keep at this all this time? First of all, I say, I don't, just because something is hard doesn't make it less important. It's more important if it's hard. But also because we see the good stuff that you don't see. We see that security cooperation that is thwarting attacks, hundreds of attacks a year. Gadi Eisenkot will tell you. He'll tell you about like 500 kids, Israeli teenagers that will lose their way in the West Bank and they're returned to their Israeli homes by the Palestinian Authority security. This is not me taking the Palestinians' word for it. It's listening to the Israelis. So in my view, deeds.
I get all of that, David, but let me interrupt though, because there are certainly the security arrangements which we're aware of, which works both ways. Certainly it's part of what's kept Abbas alive in any.
Exactly.
Okay, but when there is the pay to slay, for slay, the paying of the Palestinian terrorist families, when even this refusal of aid during the coronavirus to be sent to the Palestinian territory that the UAE sent because it came through Israel, cutting off your nose. So again, yes, there are those kinds of things, but what is being done on the Palestinian side to help to prepare the ground, the karka, for accommodation, for living side by side in peace? Especially, we heard from Einat Wilf the other day about the indoctrination that goes on in the UNRWA camps and so on and so forth. So I wonder sometimes, just to wrap this question together, along with some of the ones that is do we sometimes bring a Western mentality to the whole negotiation? We think, okay, they give a little and we'll be fine. But it's not necessarily like that.
No, look, okay, good. I'm thrilled that you asked that, because I get asked this. Look, that's why I'm a gradualist. You see, I don't think we should be pushing the envelope. Albert Einstein said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. And that's why Dennis and me, again, we get attacked all the time from the left end zone. We're saying, what use is there to go to final status? If Abbas, for his personal reasons, doesn't want to be seen as the guy who signed away for perpetuity that refugees could go to Israel, and he can't do it, then why push it? You know, I mean, the idea that they're, you know, if someone would have said, let me flip it a bit. If 25 years ago at Oslo, 27 years ago, or 20, whatever it is, 27 years, someone would say to you, look, there's good news and bad news. The bad news is that on the toughest nut issues, the parties have not been able to narrow the gap. Yet, for 27 years, these guys will find a way to have a Palestinian Authority working with Israel on security and other issues to make life bearable for each side. It's not what they all want, but it's what they've been able to maintain, and they'll keep at it because in their own self-interest, as you point out correctly, and I think that's good. If people do things for self-interest, it's sustainable over time. So my view is gradually see what is possible. Does that mean we shouldn't push back on things? Of course we should push back. On Taylor Force that you mentioned, the Taylor Force law, I know, and I mentioned this thing myself before you even raised it with me. I said hitting the single. They have to know that this is objectionable, and they've lost a lot of aid over it. Privately, they'll tell you that they have to change their ways, but to me, the test is not what they tell me privately. I never believed that was important. It's what they do publicly. So my point is, we have to do this gradually, and we should. If you know, if for whatever reason Abbas can't be the guy to sign it away, that doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater. You know, if it's in the Middle East, my fear is this: it comes down to one sentence. If it's all or nothing, it becomes nothing, and we should avoid all or nothing things. If we could save lives and provide dignity to both sides by going more gradually, so be it. And they'll have to, you know, they have to know that just because they take a tough stand, if their stand is unreasonable, then Israel will push back, and that's just the way it is. So I think these structures, you know, let's look at this in historic terms. For almost 100 years, all right, these two national movements did not recognize each other. Now I will say Israel, you know, would perform much better than the other side, because in 1947 at the UN partition, Israel was willing to take half a loaf and they were not. And I would say at Camp David, same, you know, Israel was willing to settle for less, they were not. So, you know, in the big picture, Israel has gone further. But the truth is that these two national interests have to learn, like the tractate of Baba Metzia, you know, when both sides claims the Talit, Yachloku, they have to divide it. And if they're not ready to make the final points of the final points, okay, so we won't get there. We'll do what's possible, what's feasible, and not maybe what is desirable. So none of this is to excuse objectionable behavior. I want to be, it's very important to me, very, very important to me, you know, that is said. And there's objectionable behavior too on Israel's side as well. But I think that
in this context, is Israel right when it insists that the Arabs have to recognize Israel as a Jewish homeland of the Jewish people?
I think so. I felt that way in the negotiations in 2013-14. I showed Kerry polls. You know, 75% of Israelis thought if you can't recognize someone's identity, you know, your recognition is certainly flawed here. And this is not just views of right-wing Israelis. These were views of Israelis across the board. I thought it was a legitimate demand. Their view is, look, we said at Oslo, we recognize a place called Israel. That's not good enough for you. And my view is, look, this is a very unique conflict. It isn't a conflict about real estate. It's a conflict about identity. And you have to come to grip with the other guy's identity. So they'll say, you want me to sing Hatikva? They're not going to sing Hatikva. But there has to be some basic recognition of the entity that you're recognizing. I think it was a legitimate point that Israel pushed it.
And it also helps to explain why the denial of the Jewish connection to the Temple Mount and so on.
Yeah. Well, that was uniquely Arafat too. I mean, he said it was in Yemen. He said it was in Nablus. You know, that's really what triggered Sharon's stroll on the Temple Mount where the Intifada started. So, you know, this stuff is, and by the way, I don't want to obviously excuse anything, but I have found in a lot of Arab societies, any civilization that's pre-Islamic gets pretty short shrift in Arab history books. That might be true, you could say, you know, for other cultures as well.
So tying this together with this annexation thing, and I eventually want us to move off of that, but I have a couple of questions about that. And that is, is it worth it for Israel to jeopardize the possibility of those positive relations with the Arab countries that exist there? But on the other hand, is there something to be said for maybe, like you quoted Einstein before, maybe mixing it up a little bit and trying something a little bit different? After all, each time the Palestinians have been offered something, Yossi Klein Halevi had once said, come back to the negotiating table using that as their starting point, and by saying no, they keep eventually getting more. This is the first time they're told guys, you're going to get less.
I wrote that about the Trump plan. It's the one thing I liked about it on a policy level. I try to stay out of the partisanship. It's very hard, but I try to stay out of it. It's a very polarized minefield. But that was the one thing I liked about the Trump thing, was that every peace plan is kind of tried to make it sweeter. And this is a way of saying, look, time is on your side. But look, annexation, I don't think is the answer. Because I'll tell you very simply, I mean, look, for 50 years, we have been hearing about settlements. Once we put down settlements, then they'll realize time is not on their side. It didn't work that way for 50 years. So I'm not sure that in and of itself, annexation is going to be helpful. I just see it hurtful on so many fronts. I'm always wondering, what is the strategic advantage for Israel? And when I hear general after general who I trust, whose job it is to maintain these relationships, saying, David, we don't get anything out of this. This is only downside for us. I do take that seriously. So I want to be very careful. I don't want to question the motivations of people who are for it. They might say, look, it's coming not from malice, it's coming from despair that this thing is going to end. But, Israel has a real stake in these relationships. Look, the fact that the Emirati ambassador to the United States, Yosef Oteba, who I know very well, wrote an op-ed in Yediot Achronot in Hebrew and did a TV thing too, saying, listen, we want to get closer to you guys, but don't make it harder for us. Make it easier. The problem is that American Jews don't see this part at all, okay, because it's not in their world, and I get that. But in the Arab world, in the Middle East, there's a kind of a media spin machine that starts with Al Jazeera in Qatar. And then it expands to Iran, not Arab, but Persian in the Middle East, and Turkey, not Arab, but adjacent to the Middle East. And that spin machine is always out to show that the Arab regimes are sellouts, that they're, pro-American apologists or Zionists even, God forbid for them. And what it ends up doing in these non-democratic countries, you say, well, they're not democracy, they shouldn't care about public opinion. But the irony is, because they're not legitimate, they care more about public opinion than the average American politician, if you can imagine that. So when this spin machine starts, they have to always almost outbid them. And they get stuck in this corner. And it's, I think these regimes, these relationships are very important. I'm not here to say that if Israel does it, all those relationships will stop, because Iran will still be in their interest to thwart working with Israel. Israeli technology will remain Israeli technology, but Israel wants not just to be under the table. There's a line of Meir Dagan, and I offend anyone, not meaning to offend anyone's sensibilities, so I'll say that in advance, but Meir Dagan, the former head of the Mossad, is quoted as saying the following to Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying, Israel's the mistress of the Middle East. Everyone wants to be with us, just not in public. And Israel wants to be in public too. Israel wants to be invited to Expo 2020, which is now Expo 2021 because of COVID in Dubai. And there's a lot of other over-the-table stuff. And Israel always pushes the envelope to get more recognition. And they said, listen, all that stuff, we can't do that if you do this. So I'm not trivializing that it's all down to Dubai 2020. It isn't, of course. But I just think you need to deepen those relationships that have a lot of signs of growth. And that I try to think of what's good for Israel. And if these generals are telling me, David, this is the stuff we care about. We don't want the PA to collapse. We don't want to face a one-state solution. We don't want Jordan to collapse. The Hashemites are our buffer. And these Israeli-Arab relationships are fantastic for us. We don't want to jeopardize that. Now, I don't need generals to tell me that. I know that as an analyst. So I'm trying to think like, okay, well, give me some upside here. So that's why, respectfully, I'm concerned here, but I want people to understand there's a road. It didn't come out of nowhere. It started with the Second Intifada. and this frustration and the loss of the peace camp because of the violence 20 years ago.
But for us American Jews, so much of the emphasis is on the Palestinian issue. And yet for Israelis, certainly for Prime Minister Netanyahu, and pretty much the broad consensus in Israel is that Iran is the real threat, and that that's the major concern, and that everything else is really secondary. So first of all, I was wondering if you could maybe just share a little bit. I don't know, I know you focus more on the Palestinian issue, but what's been happening in Iran, with all of these explosions and things like that, and in terms of Iran's role driving some of the Arab states closer to Israel, et cetera. And then we have this thing with Turkey just the other day, announcing that they're going to change that place back, which was a museum, back into a mosque, and so on. So let's talk about some of those other.
Look, with Iran, I think, I jokingly say they should get the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing Israel and the Arabs so close together. It is a remarkable turn of events that has brought them closer together. There's no doubt that here, too, I think we have to be very candid in saying that with the presidential timetable, it could be Netanyahu's going to say, okay, if, Biden wins, they might start on the road to JCPOA 2.0. That's the Iran nuclear deal. It might be better because it'll have a longer timeline than like the way we want it. But if we want to hit certain Iranian sites, the window might be closing. So I think there's a clear decision in tempo to step up these strikes. And I have no doubt that the Natanz assembly plant thing, where they hit advanced centrifuges, not the old ones, but the new ones that are being researched are, I don't think this is coming from Micronesia or the Marshall Islands. I think it's clear where that's coming from. Doesn't mean every explosion in Iran is because of Israel, but I think they have some real engineering problems. But anyway, so I think Israel's doing what it's got to do to defend itself. And I think that's legitimate, personally.
So in that context, how important is the Palestinian issue for?
It's like if someone said to you, your heart is and your brain are your most important organs. That might be true, but you need all your organs to function, as well. So the issue doesn't have to be the number one issue, but it might be only number two, or it might be number three after Hezbollah. Okay, so maybe it's the number three issue. But if you're a security planner, you've got to think on all fronts. You want everything to work. It's not good enough just the number one issue is stopped. So, I'm in total agreement that Iran is existential for Israel. But the Palestinian issue is not an irrelevant issue because of these, the things I said. I'm really worried. I'm more worried about, I'll put it in very blunt terms. I'm worried about the failure there, what it's going to mean for the standing of Israel in the United States, which I think blows back to Israel. Because, look, in 2016, you had a liberal president who signed a $38 billion MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. There's no country in the Middle East or the world that has America's credit card for the next 10 years to spend $38 billion. It just doesn't exist. Israel is unique, thank God, okay? But my fear is what we're hearing from, I don't like to name names, but, the Bernie Sanders wing is, no, we should start deducting aid from military aid. It used to always be walled off, a consensus. We can have policy disagreements here, but security is holy, sacrosanct, walled off. It's not walled off anymore.
No.
And there's now, they might not prevail, that wing might not prevail. I don't think they will prevail. But it's like, again, you're the rabbi, not me, but it's the rabbinic commentary on Amalek that, I'm not comparing anyone to Amalek, God forbid, but that Asher Karcha Baderech, the commentator said, what was it about Amalek? He cooled you off. You were on a winning streak. You came out of Egypt. No one wanted to mess with you. This slows you down. And I think this slows you down. It really creates cracks in the wall. So I see it very quickly. If military assistance is now going to become controversial, or not a consensus, I should say, what that means 5, 10, 15 years out if the debate shifts along the American lines to say, hey, this isn't about land paradigm, this is about rights.
So
And do they get a vote? And that's a hard debate to win. Doesn't mean Israel won't prevail, and Israel's not going to commit suicide. But you got to think interactively. If you're a policy analyst, you have to play like six-dimensional chess at the same time. And you've got to think, holy cow, you know, if the debate changes in the United States about Israel to DNA about one person, one vote, that's going to translate into military aid. You know, it's only a matter of time. So you've got to think ahead.
So within this context, then, you know, you're kind of dancing close to the edge of the issue about the Democratic Party, progressive, you know, possibly pulling away from Israel a little bit. What a Biden administration might look like. You referred to Obama's $38 billion credit card being given to Israel, and yet we've read in recent weeks about his parting gift to Israel, which was. You know, the United Nations vote where they didn't veto and in fact wanted to put up something there. So do you have, you know, what can you say in regard to the concern about that drift?
Yeah, no, it's a very fair question. And the rabbis are the best place to actually discuss it because you represent a cross-section of congregants in different parts of the country. I mean, I'm concerned. I try not to be partisan about it, and I understand that, you know, people, you know, could see things that you know, Trump has done for Israel that I don't gainsay. I mean, you know, the embassy moving to Jerusalem and the issue of the Golan recognition and rescinding the JCPOA. You know, I think it could have been done differently. Fine. But the point is that I see the advantages. But I also go to college campuses, Rabbi. I don't think there's anyone who's traveled to more campuses on BDS than me. I think I've made 148 visits, and now I'm stuck with Zoom like everybody else. But I'm worried that the syllogism that goes like this, you know, I hate Trump. Trump loves Netanyahu, therefore I hate Netanyahu and Israel. That scares me. And I just think that, you know, we got to think about that, what that means. And again, this is not a pitch to go Democrat, Republican. I do think with Biden, he is not, I don't put him in the camp with AOC and Sanders. I don't. I think that he represents kind of an old school in the Democratic Party that is a very proud Zionist. And I think that's, you know, people who want bipartisanship to continue, you know, that's exactly the sort of person you want. I mean, look, a cautionary tale for American Jews should be the U.S.-Saudi relationship. And the U.S.-Saudi relationship was based on the idea that we're hearing more and more from certain people, which is it doesn't matter what you know, the Democrats think. We have the Republicans. And by the way, I would think the same argument is true if it was reversed. It doesn't matter what the Republicans think as long as we have the Democrats. The genius of Israel was always to focus on both. Just as the genius of Israel was to make the interest proposition that U.S.-Israel closeness is good for U.S. interests, it was always to make the U.S.-Israel values proposition, that we share the same values. And that sometimes gets lost. And I don't want that card to be taken from Israel. And I'm worried about that a lot. And I think the cautionary tale with the Saudis, though, it goes like this, that they never thought that you needed both. They never thought like I do, which is that interests can bind governments, but values bind societies, American and Israeli, not just U.S. government, Israeli government. It's people with people. The genius of Israel is that it played both baseball and football at the same time. It was brilliant, and it worked to keep both Republicans and Democrats together. And who didn't do it? The Saudis. The Saudis said, look, as long as we have Republicans, we don't need Democrats. We can put all our eggs in one basket. And Bandar, the Saudi ambassador during the Clinton years, lived in Geneva, Switzerland. I know it sounds crazy, you won't believe it, but it's the truth. He thought I didn't need Democrats. He was called Bandar Bush. I have the Republicans, but guess what? With the Khashoggi horrific tragedy happening, all of a sudden the Saudis look around, they have no friends in this country because they didn't water the garden. They didn't condition the societal landscape, and they ignored bipartisanship at their peril. That's something Israel cannot afford to do. And the brilliance of Israel, after having an IDF, an Israeli Defense Forces, which gets the most credit for Israel's security, but was to understand the importance of bipartisanship in really maintaining very close ties, to work both the issue of interest and the issue of common values. And Israel should not cede those cards. It's suicidal to cede those cards. And you have to work on both sides of the aisle.
I certainly think this is a role that rabbis have can play
Right.
very effectively. I've
Absolutely.
spoken sermons prior to previous elections and said when I said I want the Republican Party's candidate best friends and closest advisors to be Jews and lovers of Israel, and for the same in terms of the Democratic Party candidate.
Exactly.
So in regard to the situation there, one last question about this, and I want to move a little bit to one or two other things. Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, just in a few words, what's happening in their relationship these days?
It's interesting. I mean, look, the Hamas thing, look, I don't want to get too excited here because I really think Hamas, you know, Jewish history teaches you when your enemies say they want to destroy you, you got to believe them. So, but what's interesting is something really interesting, and I hope it'll, you know, take longer root, but I don't want to give them any credit for it at this point, is that thanks to Egypt and actually the UN envoy, who's very capable, he doesn't fit the cookie cutter view we have of United Nations officials, Nikolai Mladenov, thanks to Egypt and Mladenov and the Israelis shouldn't bet, frankly, there has been an effort under the table to create a basic truce between Israel and Hamas since March of 2019. It started, let's say, in April. I saw that in talking in Egypt with their security officials. I made a trip just to focus on this one point. I made a special trip to Egypt. I said, this is the only thing I really want to know about is the Egypt Hamas. Of course, Hamas is in Gaza. Gaza's on Egypt's doorstep, you know, and the Egyptians will say to you, look, David, we're overwhelmed economically. You know, we're not the Arab country, you know, that we were the leaders of the Middle East. We have to focus inward. But Gaza, we care about. It's on our doorstep. We want there to be a truce with Israel. And so you've got Yahya Sinwar, who I still think is a terrorist. I haven't changed my views about him. But his view is if I can improve the life of my public, you know, more fishing rights, more trucks, more anything to improve the economic standing, okay, I'll do it. If I'm not, then I'm a collaborator if I continue along these lines. But Israel and him have found a modus vivendi and have basically been down this road for a year and a quarter now. And sometimes, like I say, the news isn't what happened, it's what doesn't happen. And it's quiet in Gaza. Now, does that mean they control the Islamic Jihad? No, but I'll tell you, when Israel bumped off one of the leaders of the Islamic Jihad, Hamas did nothing because Hamas has a truce with Israel. So it's interesting what's going on there. So it's worth following. Again, I don't want to give credit to Hamas. They've not become Zionists. In terms of their reconciliation between the two of them, I don't see it. As long as Abbas and Hamas they're both entrenched in their positions and they're both happy to be kind of the kings of their kingdom, one in the Gaza, one in the West Bank. So, I mean, it's sad. They've talked about reconciliation talks since 2007. I don't think it's any closer.
Before I give you a chance to comment on two issues of the day, one last quick question that was sent in, and that was that there were riots outside the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem last night. You mentioned that you do follow the Israeli press very closely.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about whether or not this may lead to either, you know, different new elections, also with the coronavirus thing and so on?
Look, we have to see. I mean, there was a massive demonstration also Saturday night, even during Corona at Rabin Square. I don't know, there were 80,000. I mean, it's hard to count crowds precisely, but it's clearly the biggest demonstration. Look, there's no doubt that the economic fallout is creating a lot of pain of Corona. Now, we have lucky that the dollar is the kind of the currency of the world, and the Fed keeps printing money, although there's limits there too, I believe. But the Fed's position that, you know, basically to back up everything, to create an amazing social safety net and $4 trillion or whatever it is in fiscal aid, not just monetary assistance of the Fed, that combination has, you know, we see it in the stock market going up and avoiding, you know, problems here. And I'm not saying it's totally avoided. There's tragic bread lines and cars, but, you know, so people are hurting. There's pain out there. It's real in America. So you got to assume it's real in Israel, and they don't have the same social safety net. It's ironic. They were a socialist country, but they don't have the Fed behind them in the same way. So the amounts of money they've doled out is fairly parsimonious compared to America. So there's a lot of pain. And you add on that, you know, it was very, someone's going to write a textbook on does it mean to be politically tone deaf? It means you don't go to the Knesset Finance Committee asking for reimbursements for your swimming pool in Caesarea when people don't have money for bread. So Bibi, who's usually so sharp, he's so astute, he was asleep at the wheel, I think, of that. Then he pulled it at the last second. But that and the corruption thing are going to play itself out. Will lead to fourth elections. I don't think anyone has an appetite for elections now. When you have close to 1 million unemployed people, even if Bibi's ahead in the polls, although he's lost 8 seats, but some of the numbers have gone to Yamina. The Yamina is the party to his right of Naftali Bennett. So it doesn't mean that the right is lost. It means he is lost. I don't see him going to elections in such a time of economic dislocation. I personally think, I was supportive of I know I was criticized when Gantz joined him. I just feel you've tried 3 elections and there's a pandemic. The combination of a pandemic and 3 elections, guess what? You have to come together and find a way forward. So I kind of think, it'll be Israeli style. There'll be a lot of screaming and yelling and shouting, but I don't see what the alternative is to a unity government at this time of real pain to people.
Thank you. The last question, and before I do, I just want to remind everyone to please be sure to join us next Tuesday with Danny Dayan, and that you can feel free to go on our website, zionistrabbis.org, to get any and all of the interviews that we've been recording. And in addition to that, please, we'll send them out. You can share them with others, and please be sure to join if you haven't. So now back to David. Last question. Lot in the last 24, 48 hours. Well, actually, if I say the last week or so, in the press in regard to the Peter Beinart article that appeared in the New York Times, as well as, and you have written a response with David in American Interest, and also the Barry Weiss resignation. I want to kind of roll those 2 together just to serve it up to you to respond to either or both of them in terms of, the most hottest issues that are right off the press. And
Great, thank you. Well, again, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity for an hour. I'm happy with your rabbis across the country who want to do other Zoom calls for their communities to be in touch with me. Go to davidmakovsky.com. I hope you listen to my podcast, because I think for people who are committed to the issue of Israel, a podcast is a way. It was also not just to reach young people, but older people too. Everyone's listening to podcasts and a book. The website on maps. I hope there's a lot there. So I hope that people could be in direct touch if they have questions. And I'm happy to come to your communities. And thank you for circulating my coordinates. Look, in terms of Peter, I hope people read the piece that Dennis Ross and I wrote, why we think he's so wrong on this. And it's hard for me to summarize the argument. And I know we got 2 minutes till the top of the hour. We don't have a lot of time. I just feel that anyone knows the Middle East knows that we're not in a post-sectarian age, that the primordial loyalties are to ethnic groups and not necessarily to nation states. If you look at the bloodshed in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Libya, what you see is the bloodiest wars are ethnic civil wars. And having a unitary state plastered over it with a flag and a soccer team does not solve those fundamental things of that people's loyalty is to their religion and to their ethnic group. And these are the worst wars. Now, where there are no wars, Jordan, where there is no such ethnic strife between Sunni and Shia, or Egypt, there's Copts, very few Copts relatively. But what we've seen is the guns turn inward. And I'm convinced that they are, and I'm sorry to say that Peter's piece just makes no, reference to that, where the Middle East is at. And, makes it sound like it's a utopian place where it is not. And it's these, and by the way, these post-ethnic world, we haven't seen India and Pakistan come together. And by the way, binationalism has not solved nationalist conflicts. Yugoslavia split apart. Czechoslovakia split apart. Cyprus basically doesn't function in its original form to deal with both Turkish and Greek Cypriots. So, binationalism is a problematic outside the Middle East, but inside the Middle East, it's deadly. So I just think it's a recipe for instant bloodshed. I think also, as a proud Zionist, Israel has built up a fantastic country, a thriving culture. Over 9.9 million Israeli citizens, 7 million of them are Jewish, approximately 2 million are Arab. It's got a GDP per capita like Japan and France. And it's, despite all the wars of 48, 56, 67, 73, it's unbelievable. And it didn't gather the exiles, over 1 million people from the Soviet Union. And places like Yemen, Ethiopia, Syria, I could go on and on. This doesn't look like a failed state to me. It's hard to say you've built these two structures. You've built Israel, you've built the Palestinian Authority, and now say, let's demolish everything we built and let's start over and let's just roll the dice. I just don't see that. I think it's irresponsible and in a height of fantasy.
Article to learn more.
Right, and I would just say on Barry Weiss, look, I read a resignation letter. I was really, you know, it's very upsetting. I mean, the New York Times is, I think, a pride of place for many Americans who grew up reading it. I mean, she portrays like a tolerance of, a culture of intolerance that is taking hold there. You know, you can say, oh, it's interesting. They print Peter Beinart, but they don't print responses to Peter Beinart. You know, is that symbolic of these shifts that are going on, that they're, I hope not, you know, because I think the New York Times is an important place in American society. So I hope that maybe her resignation will be a wake-up call. I don't know. I'm not an expert. I know many people at the Times of the news section. They're excellent journalists, but the opinion pages should reflect balance of diversity of views, because a democracy is based on this idea of exchange of information. And through that debate, we get to a better place. So here's praying that the opinion pages are restored to a place that they should play in American life.
David, thank you first and foremost for your time with us today. But beyond that, you were truly an Ohev Shalom, and not only an Ohev Shalom, but a Rodef Shalom, as well as being Ohev Yisrael. So for your tireless efforts and work and your brilliant analysis, we are ever indebted to you. So thank you very much. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Hopefully we'll see you next week with Danny Dayan, who will be concluding his role as ambassador to the Jewish community in America, also known as Consul General of Israel in New York. So Ryan Tovim, take care. Thank you.
Be well. Be well. Glad to be with you.